My name was Alexis Chambers, and the night my father told me I was too broken to serve again, I decided I would never beg to be seen in a room built on rank and memory. The Centennial Officers' Hall stood under a hammered steel sky, its limestone steps still damp from late rain, its windows bright with chandelier light and old applause. I paused at the entrance just long enough to feel the familiar pressure behind my ribs, that old compression of breath I had once mistaken for fear and later recognized as containment. I entered anyway. Inside, the air carried polish, starch, and the faint metallic note of old medals warmed by bodies and spotlights. Regimental banners hung in formal sequence from the rafters, each one backlit like a shrine to service someone else was allowed to narrate. Waitstaff moved in narrow lanes between round tables dressed in white linen, balancing trays with the precision of a drill team. At the front, beneath the foundation seal in brass, stood retired Brigadier Roland Chambers, posture unchanged by age, voice still calibrated for command and fundraising in equal measure. He didn't need to see me to know exactly where I was in the room. He had trained himself to map everyone by function. By the first week of October, the foundation dinner had become the event where donors purchased proximity to memory, and memory itself was edited for comfort. My invitation had arrived in a thick envelope with the old crest embossed in navy wax, the same crest my father used when he wanted to make authority feel hereditary. The card had read in controlled script, Alexis Chambers, former flight lead, special recognition seating. I knew better than to trust ornamental language from men who treated placement as a weapon, but I carried the card anyway, folded inside my program as if paper might still mean what it claimed. A junior coordinator checked names at the inner doors. She found mine, then frowned at her tablet, then glanced over my shoulder toward the stage, awaiting instruction from someone she could not afford to displease. The pause lasted 3 seconds, and each second said more than any announcement. Finally, she handed me a neutral smile and directed me toward table 19, a rear placement near the service corridor where the view of the podium cut off at shoulder height. "There's been a seating adjustment, ma'am," she said. Her tone was apologetic. Her posture was not. This was a practiced maneuver. I took the card from her and saw my name crossed through once, in blue ink, replaced by a number and no title. I had seen redactions cleaner than that in operational reports. This one was meant to be seen. No one greeted me by name as I walked past tables 1 through 6, where Foundation Board members sat with serving officers and selected guests whose biographies had been printed in silver font along the menu border. I heard fragments as I moved, procurement updates, theatre readiness projections, condolence stories told with polished restraint. At table 4, an old colonel I had once briefed on extraction protocols looked directly at me and then down at his water glass, as if eye contact itself had become a procedural risk. At table 6, 2 donors read the commemorative roll and traced each name with manicured fingers, pausing at vacancies where late additions had been inserted. I already knew whose name had been removed before I reached my chair. The commemorative roll sat on a brass stand beside the stage, lit from below. It listed honorees, keynote speakers, and special acknowledgements for former operational leads. My name had been there when the draft circulated to the board 2 days earlier. Tonight, the line was gone, the spacing tightened to hide the omission. Roland had not erased me in anger. He had erased me with editorial care. When dinner service began, he stepped to the podium and the room settled into that institutional quiet that resembles respect until you hear what is done with it. He thanked benefactors by full name, listed campaign totals to the dollar, and recited service records in the language he trusted most. Dates, ranks, commendations, transfer orders, cumulative impact. He built legitimacy the way some men build walls, course by course with no visible mortar, no easy point of entry. Then he moved to acknowledgements of family support, and his gaze found me at the back without hesitation. "We gather to preserve standards," he said, hands resting on either side of the lectern. "Not sentiment, standards." A soft murmur of assent moved through the first rows. "Some stories remind us what discipline produces, others remind us what happens when it fails." He inclined his head toward table 19. "My daughter is with us tonight as a cautionary tale." The room did not gasp. Rooms like that did not gasp. They recalibrated. He let the sentence travel, then added in a voice that could have cut through rotor wash, "Sit down, Alexis. Real officers only." Laughter followed in polite fragments, a brittle sequence of social permissions rather than amusement. A few people lowered their eyes at once. A few smiled too long. One board member looked toward the exits, not the stage, counting consequences. Someone near table 2 whispered, "Unfortunate," with the tone of a person discussing weather. I remained standing for one measured breath, then placed my fingertips on the back of my chair and answered, "Understood, sir." I sat because refusal would have fed the story he had already prepared for me. Volatile, unstable, unable to accept command structure. I had learned the architecture of his tactics years before, but that night he rendered them in full view and called it governance. A waiter arrived with my place setting 2 minutes late and set only one fork. I noticed because omission had become a language I spoke fluently. From the stage, Roland resumed his remarks without interruption, moving from donor recognition to legacy planning, from legacy planning to institutional trust, as though he had not just turned his daughter into a cautionary prop for men who congratulated themselves on moral seriousness. Silence was not peace. It was surrender when chosen to avoid discomfort, and discipline when chosen to preserve leverage. That distinction had kept me alive before. It kept me upright now. Halfway through the first course, a foundation aide approached the brass stand and removed the commemorative roll, replacing it with a revised printout as casually as one changes dessert cards. She glanced once toward my table, then away. I watched her carry the original roll behind the curtains near the side corridor, where records boxes were stacked for post-event archiving. The movement was routine enough to evade scrutiny, deliberate enough to prove intent. Evidence did not always arrive wearing urgency. Sometimes it crossed the room in flats and low heels. At table 19, 3 seats remained empty through salad and soup, then filled by service staff on break who ate quickly without speaking to me. I did not blame them. This hall ran on rank gradients and gratuity economics. Conversation itself could be career liability. At the next table over, 2 retired officers discussed board appointments. One said, not softly enough, "Some people can't let go of uniforms they no longer deserve." The other answered, "It spares everyone trouble when standards are clear." Neither looked at me. They did not need to. I traced the edge of my water glass and catalogued details the way I had catalogued landing zones under blackout conditions. Who initiated exclusion, who executed it, who witnessed and remained inert. The list was not fueled by anger, though anger was present in controlled measure, warm and steady beneath the sternum. The list was fueled by clarity. Roland's influence did not depend on truth, it depended on an audience convinced that his version of events was the only administratively safe one to repeat. Every laugh fragment in that hall was an affidavit of convenience. When the program shifted to recognition of fallen crews, the room stood. I stood with them. Names were read, bells sounded, and for 60 seconds, no one spoke. In that silence, I remembered the simple fact he could not edit. I had served those names beside men and women who cared less about family mythology than about whether you held your line when conditions degraded and options narrowed. Their standard had never been pedigree. It had been competence under pressure. Roland borrowed their memory as a stage backdrop while denying the principle they had lived by. After the memorial interval, he invited selected guests to the dais for photographs. My name was not called. A coordinator approached my table and lifted my program booklet without asking, as though objects placed before me were now unassigned property. At the stage, Roland placed one hand between the shoulder blades of a young captain for the camera, paternal and public, then shifted left so the foundation seal sat directly above his insignia pin. He knew exactly how images outlasted facts. That was the moment I understood my wound, in its final, unsentimental shape. I had spent years believing the injury was rejection. It was not. Rejection implied a decision made once. This was repetition engineered into ritual, an administrative weather system designed to keep me peripheral in every room he curated. He didn't need to shout to diminish me. He needed only invitations, seating charts, and a microphone. I did not leave early. Leaving would have been interpreted as confession. I stayed through dessert, through the auction pledges, through the final standing ovation for institutional stewardship. When the applause ended, Roland stepped down from the stage and moved table to table receiving handshakes. At table 19, he paused just long enough to let people see him pause. His face remained composed, the expression of a man confident in the order of his own narrative. "You handled yourself properly." he said quietly. Thank you for clarifying my position, I replied. He gave a short nod, satisfied perhaps that the line had held, then turned away to greet a donor with both hands. By the time I reached the foyer, the waxed floors reflected only clean-up lights and the blurred movement of staff resetting the hall for a morning briefing. I stood beneath the framed campaign map near the cloakroom and looked at my own reflection in the glass. Formal black dress, foundation lapel pin still attached, posture unbroken, face unreadable to strangers and fully legible to me. Something in me had not shattered. It had settled. Outside, rain began again, light and orderly, tapping the stone balustrade in precise intervals. I did not call anyone. I did not draft a message I might regret. I walked down the steps, counted each one, and made the only promise that mattered in a structure built to deny me visibility. I would not ask Roland Chambers for acknowledgement, permission, or restoration. I would wait for verifiable truth, place it where procedure required, and let the same institutions he used as shields become witnesses instead. I had just reached the last step when the main doors opened behind me and released another wave of light, conversation, and wet wool into the rain. The brass handles struck the stops with a hard, practiced sound, and the line of departing guests widened beneath the portico, each of them calculating whether to wait for a car or gamble on the short run to the curb. I moved toward the edge of the awning, ready to disappear into weather and distance when I heard Roland's voice rise above the valet calls. "Alexis! Stay where you are!" He did not shout. He projected, and projection in that crowd functioned like a summons. People turned in increments. A colonel I recognized from Logistics Command paused with his coat half on. Two donors stopped beside the campaign plaque near the door and kept their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The junior coordinator who had redirected my seat stood with a clipboard tucked to her chest, posture rigid with the fear of being visible during someone else's power display. Roland stepped down one stair, immaculate in dark overcoat and regimental tie, and took his place where both the foyer and the curb lane could see him. "You should not be travelling alone tonight," he said, "given your history." The phrase landed with the precision of a filed memorandum. Not your evening, not the rain, not concern in human language. Your history. I held his gaze. I am fully capable of getting home. He shifted his attention to the men nearest him, letting them witness the exchange as if it were administrative housekeeping. "You see what I manage," he said, almost conversationally. "Boundary issues persist. This is what happens when emotional events are confused with service records." No one answered him. Silence gathered under the awning, dense as humidity. A valet runner jogged past with keys held high, slowed when he felt the tension, then continued toward a waiting sedan without looking left. Roland turned back to me. "Hand me your foundation pin!" For 1 second I thought I had misheard him through rain striking stone, but he repeated it with even cleaner diction. "You are not currently in good standing to wear organizational insignia. Remove it." The pin was small, navy enamel bordered in silver, fixed to my lapel above the seam. A symbolic object, nothing more. In that room and under that awning, symbolism was how authority rehearsed itself. A board member in a camel coat stepped forward, half a pace. "Brigadier, perhaps this can be handled privately." Roland did not look at him. "Public correction follows public confusion." Then he gave me the quote he wanted the crowd to carry into every retelling. "You were seated tonight by courtesy, not by right. Do not mistake tolerance for reinstatement." Rain thickened, drumming on the awning hard enough to blur the streetlights into vertical streaks. The scent of wet limestone and fuel drifted up from the curb. I felt anger move through me in a narrow, controlled line. Not a wave, the old instinct to answer instantly, to tear through his script before it hardened into record. I let the instinct pass without using it. I unclasped the pin, placed it on my palm, and extended my hand. "I won't be keeping borrowed symbols," I said. He took it between thumb and forefinger as if accepting evidence from a contaminated scene. The junior coordinator dropped her eyes. Someone exhaled sharply to my right, the sound of a person who had expected tears and received procedure instead. Roland slipped the pin into his coat pocket and reached again, this time toward the lanyard tucked inside my bag. "Your archival access badge as well." That stopped me. The badge was inactive but valid for records appointments, and he knew exactly what it represented. A path to documents he had spent years teaching people not to open. It is not Foundation property, I said. It was issued through records. He angled his body so the listeners saw profile and command line, not the calculation underneath. Issued on my sponsorship. Return it. A woman from the memorial committee spoke without stepping forward. General policy does not route through personal sponsorship. Roland answered her with a look that had silenced officers for decades. She lowered her chin and said nothing else. I could have argued clause by clause in that doorway. I could have named procedural sections, eligibility windows, the exact memorandum that separated Foundation patronage from federal access credentials. I could have done all of it and given him what he needed most, an emotional scene to validate his diagnosis of me before witnesses with donor checks and long memories. Instead, I reached into my bag, removed the badge, and held it where everyone could see both sides. Please note, I said, voice steady, this credential is being relinquished under direct demand, not through formal revocation. The colonel with the half-buttoned coat finally looked at me, not with pity, with attention. Roland took the badge and closed his hand around it. Noted. A black SUV rolled to the curb. The driver stepped out with an umbrella, then hesitated when he sensed he had entered a ceremony he did not understand. Roland gestured him back without turning. Joseph will take you, Roland said. You are in no condition for independent transport. His favourite tactic was to make coercion sound like care in front of people trained to respect chain of command. I knew it because I had been ambushed by it for years and because every sentence followed the same architecture: claim fragility, impose restriction, call it stewardship. The crowd watched for my reaction the way spectators watch an unstable bridge in high wind, waiting to see where it gives first. I decline, I said. I have transport. He let out a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh, and addressed the group instead of me. Observe the pattern. Refusal of support, then complaint about exclusion. We have all seen this cycle. That was humiliation refined to institutional diction, not loud enough for scandal, not soft enough for deniability. 20 minutes after the ballroom applause, my body still remembered the urge to defend itself in full voice. My jaw tightened, my hands cooled, every nerve asked for action. I made the opposite choice. I stepped aside so guests could pass, creating an unobstructed lane from the doors to the valet stand, and in doing so, I withdrew the stage he had built under my feet. "Good night, Brigadier," I said. I did not call him father. The line unsettled him more than argument would have. I saw it in the fractional pause before he turned toward a donor couple and resumed his public smile. A photographer from the Foundation media team lifted his camera, caught Roland framed under the crest beside the rain-silvered columns, and lowered it again when he realized I was no longer in position to complete the narrative composition. Without me in the shot, there was no cautionary tableau. Only an aging man holding a pin and a badge he had no authority to keep. I walked from the awning into the rain. Cold struck my face and sleeves at once, clean and almost clarifying. Water ran down the back of my neck under my collar, into the space between skin and fabric where tension had been trapped all night. At the curb, cars idled in a staggered line, taillights red on wet asphalt like signal lamps in fog. I did not hurry. Haste reads as collapse. Measured movement reads as command. At the corner, I stopped beneath a municipal light and took out my phone with wet fingers. No dramatic calls, no midnight appeals. I opened a secure notes app and dictated while details remained fresh. Time, 21:47. Location, Centennial Officers Hall, East Portico. Witness density, approximately 20 to 25. Direct quotes, given your history. Seated by courtesy, not by right. Do not mistake tolerance for reinstatement. Actions compelled. Removal of Foundation insignia pin. Surrender of archival access badge under public demand. Potential witnesses to coercive language, logistics colonel, memorial committee woman, junior coordinator at check-in, valet staff. I saved the entry, encrypted it, and uploaded a duplicate to remote storage, then sent a single text to my own legal contact file labelled Deferred Counsel, the one I used when I needed a timestamp without commentary. Incident recorded. Potential interference with access credential. Will formalize statement in morning. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then the reply arrived. Received. Preserve clothing and program. Do not engage tonight. I looked back once. Through rain and distance, the hall windows glowed gold against the dark, and the people inside were already returning to coat checks and handshake routes, as if nothing consequential had occurred. That was how reputational harm survived. Not through spectacular cruelty, but through ritualized small acts no one wanted to classify as abuse because classification creates duty. I resumed walking. Water pooled at the curb cuts and soaked through my shoes by the second block, each step releasing a soft suction sound against pavement. My breathing leveled. The pressure behind my ribs eased from compression to purpose. At the bus shelter near the Veterans Memorial, I stood under cracked plexiglass and watched rain stripe the names etched in black granite across the street. I had once believed dignity required being welcomed into the room. That belief had cost me years. Dignity, I understood now, required not performing my injury for people invested in denying it. It required record, sequence, corroboration. A city bus hissed to the curb, doors folding open with hydraulic fatigue. The driver glanced at my soaked dress, then at the hall in the distance, and said nothing. I tapped my card and took a seat halfway down, near the window fogged with human breath and weather. As the bus pulled away, the Centennial Officers' Hall receded behind spray and signal lights until the crest above its doors blurred into a pale, meaningless shape. I sat with wet hands folded over an empty lapel, not calm and not broken, simply decided. I would not answer theatre with theatre. I would answer it with chain of custody, sworn statements, and names attached to facts people could not laugh away. Silence was not peace. It was the price I had paid until truth had a witness, and tonight I had begun collecting mine. I sat with wet hands folded over an empty lapel while the bus heater clicked and failed, as if even machinery had learned to ration comfort in this city. Condensation softened the window until streetlights became pale coins smudged across glass. Across the aisle, a young corporal in transit uniform slept with his head tipped against a duffel bag, mouth slightly open, one boot untied. No one bothered him. No one asked for proof that he belonged to the life he wore on his sleeve. I watched that ordinary mercy and felt the old fracture line reopen, not dramatic, not loud, just a clean internal pull where memory and present pressure met. 6 years earlier, 3 days after the extraction mission that ended with a classified incident review, I had stood in Roland's study while rain hit his windows in the same disciplined rhythm, now striking the bus roof. He had closed the door, poured 2 fingers of scotch he did not offer me, and said, "You will not contest the provisional findings in public. You are not equipped for that fight." I asked for the review packet. He told me it was above my clearance lane, though my name sat on every relevant operations log. When I said I could still serve in advisory planning pending medical clearance, he gave the verdict that became his refrain for years. "You are too broken for command environments. Accept administrative quiet." The bus lurched at a light near Mason and 3rd, and my shoulder hit the window with a soft thud that brought me back to the present. Water ran down the pane in parallel lines, each line overtaking another and dissolving into a single track. That was how he had done it. Never one grand denunciation, always parallel narratives that merged into accepted fact by repetition. At memorial breakfasts, he introduced me as Alexis, taking private time. At donor briefings, he called me our family reminder that resilience has limits. At a regional logistics symposium, when I asked a question about rotary wing extraction procurement, he smiled for the room and said, "Let's leave current doctrine to serving personnel." Men who had once requested my tactical notes laughed into their coffee cups because laughter cost less than dissent. By late November that year, I had started receiving invitations with my title removed and my meal preference omitted, small clerical edits that looked accidental, until they formed a pattern. I remembered one foundation board orientation in particular because the room had smelled of printer toner and fresh paint, and because I had arrived with a full binder of corrective recommendations no one intended to let me present. Roland placed me beside the audio-visual cart near the back wall, then opened by thanking our experienced men in active knowledge loops. He looked directly at me when he said, "Men," then shifted his gaze to the chair. Halfway through, a board treasurer asked whether trauma-exposed officers should be barred from policy subcommittees for everyone's comfort. Roland did not challenge the premise. He said, "Case by case, but caution is prudent," and the minutes recorded caution as consensus. I signed the attendance sheet and left with my binder unopened, spine uncracked, like a book purchased for display. At the next stop, the sleeping corporal woke, tied his boot, and stepped off into rain without glancing back. The driver shut the doors with a weary hiss. I checked my phone. No new messages, only the time-stamped reply from deferred counsel and the secure note I had already encrypted. The lack of incoming noise should have calmed me. Instead, it sharpened every old scene in sequence. Roland's methods had always depended on environments where hierarchy masqueraded as objectivity. In family spaces, he made jokes and called them concern. In institutional spaces, he made exclusions and called them standards. In both, he relied on my restraint as raw material for his diagnosis. There had been a winter luncheon at the officers' auxiliary where he assigned me to greet guests at the registration table, while my younger cousin, who had never held command and never wanted it, gave the keynote on legacy leadership. During photos, Roland placed his hand over my wrist and moved me 2 inches out of frame, smiling as he did it, a choreographer correcting spacing. The image circulated in the annual report with the caption, "Chamber Family Commitment to Service." My face appeared only as a partial blur beside a coat rack. He sent me the report in the mail with a handwritten note. "Proud of your cooperation." I learned to read rooms by who repeated him verbatim and who avoided quoting him in writing. The first group was ambitious. The second was afraid. Neither group defended me when it mattered. The bus crossed the river, tyres humming over steel grating, and the city opened into black water, warehouse lights, and the occasional red beacon blinking from crane tops. I pressed my thumb to the ridge where the foundation pin had been, and felt nothing but damp fabric. That absence held its own kind of relief. Symbols granted by gatekeepers could be revoked by gatekeepers. Competence archived in official logs was harder to erase, which was precisely why Roland had chased paper trails as aggressively as he curated dinners. My worst year with him was the year I tried to re-enter through process. I filed for advisory reinstatement in accordance with medical recommendations, submitted site clearance, attached performance citations, and requested review by a mixed panel. The day before the hearing, a foundation liaison called to say my packet had been misrouted. I hand-carried a duplicate to the office. The receptionist scanned my ID, then froze and disappeared behind a frosted glass door. Roland emerged instead, coat already on, expression patient. "This is not the season for your return," he said. "Do not force me to choose between family and institutional confidence." He had already chosen. He had simply named the choice as if it remained negotiable. By the time the bus reached my stop, the rain had eased to a fine, cold mist. I stepped down to pavement that reflected traffic lights in long, trembling bands and started toward my building. My shoes made soft, waterlogged sounds on concrete. At the corner pharmacy, the neon open sign flickered, then steadied. I was 20 yards from my entrance when my phone vibrated with an unknown number carrying a Federal Exchange prefix I recognized from records offices. I answered on the second ring. "Chambers." A woman's voice came through low and precise, older, with the clipped cadence of someone who had spent decades speaking carefully near microphones she did not trust. "Commander Chambers, this is Iona Mercer, Civilian Records Liaison. We met briefly at the Joint Archive Annex 2 years ago." I remembered her instantly. Silver hair pinned in a tight coil, bifocal chain, hands that moved documents as if they were fragile equipment. "Yes, ma'am." "You were at Centennial Hall tonight." It was not a question. "I was." A short pause, paper shifting on her end. "Do not go upstairs yet. If you can return to the hall service entrance within 20 minutes, I have items that should not remain in tonight's custody stream." I looked back down the block toward the bus route, calculating distance and consequence. "Are these foundation documents?" "Negative. Government-adjacent copies pending formal transfer. 1 sealed legal envelope. Legal. 1 black encrypted drive with custody notation. I cannot discuss contents over an open line." My pulse steadied into operational tempo. "Why me now?" "Because your name is on both transfer headers and because the wrong person has been touching routing slips for too long." Her tone did not rise. "Can you return?" "I can. Use the east loading dock. Tell security you're expected by Mercer for archive reconciliation. Bring identification. Come alone." The line ended without farewell. I flagged a cab at the next intersection and gave the driver the hall address. He glanced once at my soaked dress in the rearview mirror, asked no questions, and merged into traffic. We passed the Veterans Memorial again, then the dark facade of the municipal court, then the lit columns of the hall reappearing through mist like a set piece that refused to be struck after the audience left. At the east side, the grandeur gave way to concrete ramps, rolling bins, and a loading dock lit by unforgiving fluorescence. A security guard in a rain shell checked my ID, spoke into his shoulder mic, and waved me through a steel door that smelled of detergent, cardboard, and old paper. The service corridor behind the ballroom looked exactly as it had earlier. Stacked records boxes, folded staging chairs, a brass stand leaned against cinder block with a white cloth thrown over it. Iona Mercer waited beside a stainless work table under a wall clock that had stopped at 1912. She wore a navy cardigan over a records office blouse, sleeves rolled neatly to her forearms. On the table sat a legal envelope stamped with restricted routing marks and a matte black USB drive in a tamper sleeve with a government inventory strip across its seam. "You're on time," she said. "I came directly." "Good." She slid a sign-in ledger toward me. "Print full name, date, time and purpose. Retrieval pending counsel." I signed. She countersigned, then used a small metal stamp to mark both entries with an archive seal. Every movement was deliberate, procedural, almost ceremonial in its refusal to dramatize what mattered. Why weren't these transferred through normal channels? I asked. Her mouth tightened, not quite a frown. Normal channels were diverted to residential service at 0800 this morning by a standing convenience directive linked to retired Brigadier Roland Chambers. I have filed objection twice. Objections were marked resolved without comment. She tapped the envelope once with a fingernail. Tonight I found this package in a Foundation lockbox labelled donor correspondence. That classification is false. I felt heat rise behind my sternum, controlled but unmistakable. Who had access? Too many people, for too long. I am correcting what I can while I still have chain authority. She pushed the envelope toward me but kept one finger on it. Understand me clearly, Commander. I am not giving you rumour. I am giving you record. She lifted her finger. I took the envelope. My name was typed on the front with formal designation, Commander Alexis R. Chambers. Beneath it, in smaller print, service notification copy, legal residence on file, Chambers House, East Briar Road. Roland's door. Iona handed me the USB next. The tamper sleeve crackled under my grip. Inventory code. Date stamp. Initials. This drive contains corrected incident findings, your cleared command log extracts, and transmission metadata showing suppression events between review and publication, she said. Do not plug it into personal hardware. Deliver through legal intake or authorized review terminal only. For a second, the corridor seemed to narrow, fluorescent hum rising like pressure in my ears. Years of being told I was unstable, unfit, unqualified, collapsed against the plain weight of two objects resting in my hands. Not vindication yet, not safety yet, but material truth, formatted in institutional language, timed, stamped and witnessed. When was the notice issued? I asked. Original issuance 48 hours ago. Formal service attempted this morning at East Briar Road. Signature pending at time of print. Her eyes held mine, steady and unsentimental. Given tonight's events, I considered delay negligent. I slid both items into the inner waterproof sleeve of my bag. You understand what this puts at risk for you. She gave a small, almost impatient shake of her head. At my age, risk and duty are old colleagues. Then, softer. I watched you brief casualty extraction maps in this corridor 6 years ago while senior men debated optics in the next room. I remember who knew the work. That nearly undid me, not because it was praise, but because it was accurate memory offered without performance. She reached into her cardigan pocket and produced a final sheet, a one-page custody memo, with our signatures already entered from the ledger. Keep this on your person. If anyone contests possession, this is your first answer. I folded the memo and placed it inside my wallet behind my license. Thank you, Ms. Mercer. Don't thank me yet. File fast, file clean. Do not argue in hallways with men who rehearse innocence for a living. A metal cart rattled at the far end of the corridor and a janitorial crew turned the corner, pushing bins of folded linens. Iona stepped back from the table, distance restored, expression neutral. To anyone passing, we were two administrative workers closing out a long event. As I moved toward the exit, she called after me in a voice just above the fluorescent buzz. Commander. I turned. Your silence was never their proof, she said. It was their opportunity. Outside, the rain had thinned to drifting mist that beaded on my coat and cooled the heat in my chest. I crossed the loading dock with the sealed envelope and black drive secured against my ribs, tangible and heavy enough to alter my posture. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. The night had started as theatre and ended in records. That was terrain I knew how to hold. I crossed the loading dock toward the street with the bag strap cinched tight across my chest, feeling the edges of the sealed envelope pressed through fabric with each step, a physical reminder that proof had weight and that weight demanded process. Under the security light, I stopped, opened my phone, and called the deferred counsel line instead of a person, because the line generated a record before anyone spoke. The call routed on the second ring. "Intake," a man said. "Commander Alexis Chambers. I need emergency preservation and filing instructions for restricted service documents transferred under Civilian Archive Authority tonight." His keyboard clicked in short bursts. "Are the documents opened?" "No." "Any direct contact with adverse parties since transfer?" "Not since retrieval. Prior coercive contact logged at 2147. "Good. Do not break seals. Go to Federal Readiness Center, North Intake Entrance. Window C remains staffed until 0100 for military legal submissions. Ask for Chain of Custody Form JR-14A and Incident Interference Addendum." He paused, then added, "You will likely be challenged on standing. Keep your language procedural." "I understand. You're generating a protected timestamp now. Reference number 6, R-1183. Repeat it." I repeated it. He ended the call. The cab ride to the Readiness Centre took 14 minutes through wet streets and thin traffic, the driver keeping the radio low beneath weather reports that sounded detached from the city passing outside his windows. The centre rose from the block like a concrete ledger. Flat facade, narrow windows, a flag pulled hard in crosswind, lights still on in 3 floors where compliance and litigation never slept. At the north entrance, a security sergeant checked my identification twice, compared my face to a database image taken years earlier, and gave me a visitor badge with CIV-PRIOR stamped in red across the bottom. Not commander, not officer, not even former. Civilian priority, as if urgency could be decoupled from history. Window C was protected by reinforced glass and fluorescent glare that flattened everyone into the same tired palette. A legal clerk with reading glasses low on her nose slid a tray toward me without greeting. "Submission type. Restricted service notification packet and encrypted media. Chain of custody requested under JR-14A. Interference addendum attached." She looked up then, taking in my name, my soaked coat, the hour. "Do you have an assigned sponsor?" "No sponsor." Direct filing. A second clerk at the adjacent station heard my answer and said, too softly for policy but loud enough for me, "Another legacy dispute." I placed the envelope and tamper sleeve on the tray with both hands visible and my voice level. "These items were recovered from misclassified storage at Centennial Officers Hall by Civilian Liaison Iona Mercer. Transfer logged in archive ledger with seal. I need serial confirmation before I leave this counter." The first clerk scanned the labels, then straightened, the slight change in posture that happens when routine becomes risk. "Stay here." She carried the tray through a side door. I stood alone under white light while 2 janitors mopped the far corridor in slow parallel arcs, their bucket wheels squeaking every few feet. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I remained at the glass because abandonment is often easier to allege than to disprove. When she returned, she handed me 3 documents: receipt of possession, media quarantine acknowledgement, and notice of expedited review listing a 0900 Joint Readiness Legal Review Panel in room 5B. Her tone had changed from administrative fatigue to guarded respect. "You're on first docket," she said. "Do not be late. Bring this receipt, your custody memo, and identification. Panel may limit oral statements." "Who requested expedited review?" She hesitated. "Triggered automatically by content tags and recall designation markers. That's all I can provide." I signed each line where indicated, watching her stamp the pages with date and time. 12. She fed the envelope and drive into separate evidence pouches, sealed both, and read the serial numbers aloud while I repeated them back. Procedure, not trust. By 8:40 the next morning, the rain had burned off into a brittle autumn cold that made every metal railing sting on contact, and I was standing outside room 5B with a paper cup of machine coffee gone lukewarm in my hand and the receipt folder pressed under my arm. The corridor smelled of copier toner, floor wax, and the faint citrus cleaner used in federal buildings that want to suggest order. Name placards had been placed on a side table for counsel and observers. Mine read Chambers, A, no rank, no designation, black text on white card. A lieutenant at the door checked my badge and pointed to the rear row. Observers in back, until called. I am docketed as submitting party on case 6R-1183. He glanced at his tablet. Still in back until called. Inside, the room was configured as judgment theatre in miniature. 3 panel seats elevated on a shallow platform, legal officer at centre desk, counsel tables facing forward, observer chairs in 2 short ranks behind a brass rail polished by years of waiting hands. Frosted windows cut the daylight into grey strips that fell across binders and laptops like bars. I took the last seat in the second row because the first had been stacked with unopened supply boxes, an exclusion presented as logistics. Former peers entered in 2s and 3s, uniforms crisp, voices low. Commander Neil Harrow, who had once asked me for extraction brief templates at 0200 without apology, nodded past me as if acknowledging a hallway fixture. Major Eliza Trent sat at opposite counsel table, unfolded her notes and whispered to the man beside her, I was told this was a compliance clean-up, not a reputational appeal. The man answered, keep it tight, we close by 10. At 8:57, Roland walked in with Foundation counsel at his shoulder and a folio of prepared remarks under his arm, wearing a dark suit cut to military lines, and the expression he reserved for public institutions he believed he understood better than the people serving in them. He did not look at me first. He looked at the panel seats, then the observer rail, then my placement in the back row. When he finally turned, his gaze held no surprise, only annoyance that process had admitted me at all. He took his seat at the right table and said to counsel, not quietly, she escalates whenever denied relevance. I opened my folder, aligned the documents, and wrote the time in the margin. 8:59, adverse characterization on record. The legal officer, Captain Aaron Sethi, called the room to order at 9:02 and began with compressed formalities. Case number, document class, participants, confidentiality restrictions. His diction was precise and weary, the cadence of someone managing too many urgent matters on too little sleep. After introductions, he looked toward the rear. Commander Chambers, your filing triggered this review. You will have 5 minutes for Foundation and protocol requests only. This is not a reinstatement hearing. Before I could answer, Roland leaned slightly toward his microphone. For context, panel should note a long-standing pattern of grievance-based interventions by submitting party. Captain Sethi raised one hand. You will have your turn, Brigadier. I stood, acknowledged on scope. I request entry of interference addendum, confirmation of chain continuity from civilian archive retrieval to federal intake, and preservation order for all related routing slips tied to East Briar Residential Service directives. Major Trent spoke without permission. This panel is not an investigative tribunal. I kept my eyes on Sethi. Correct. Preservation precedes investigation. If slips are altered before hold, review integrity collapses. Sethi made a note. Request logged. Harrow shifted in his chair and gave me the same half-smile he had used years ago when briefing rooms turned hostile and he wanted distance from the person targeted. Commander, with respect, this reads like administrative overreach from a private family dispute. Then preserve and verify, I said. If dispute is private, records will show it. The room cooled another degree. At 9:16, a clerk entered with a printed update and placed it beside Sethi. He read, I request authenticated read-in of media inventory content sufficient to establish relevance before closure. Trent exhaled sharply. We are not opening encrypted media on an intake clock. Then assign authorized terminal and custodian now, I said. Delay without assignment invites chain challenge. Roland finally addressed me directly across the room. You are seeking relevance through grievance." The words were nearly identical to the ones he had rehearsed for years, polished by repetition, offered now to a new audience as if no one had heard the script before. I turned toward him, gave him the same measured tone I would have used in an operations update. "I am seeking record integrity." He smiled without warmth. "From the back row," Captain Sethi intervened. "Enough. This is not a family colloquy." He consulted the sheet the clerk had delivered. "Panel will take a 6-minute administrative pause. No one leaves the room." No one spoke while he stepped down to confer with his legal aid near the side door. The fluorescent hum grew loud enough to notice. A radiator clicked twice and went quiet. Behind me, an observer uncapped a pen and capped it again without writing. I sat because standing would have read as performance, and I had learned what performance cost. 3 days after the dinner at Centennial Hall, people were still telling each other I had overreacted to a difficult evening. The line reached me through 2 channels before dawn, and arrived here by posture, if not by words. Sethi returned at 9:24, with a woman in Navy service dress entering 1 pace behind him, silver oak leaves at her shoulder, ribbons aligned with geometric precision, presence so controlled the room adjusted before anyone identified her. Rear Admiral Helena Ward did not ask for attention. She occupied it by history and consequence. I had not seen her in person in 5 years. Time had sharpened her, not softened her. Every chair shifted. Harrow straightened as if a wire had been pulled through his spine. Trent closed her notebook. Roland's counsel leaned in to whisper. Roland held up a finger without taking his eyes off the Admiral. Captain Sethi spoke first. "Rear Admiral Ward has requested standing to address panel on operational record relevance. Request granted." Ward moved to the side lectern, placed a slim folder on its surface, and looked briefly toward me before facing the panel. The look contained no sentiment, only recognition under command conditions. "For the record," she said, voice low and carrying to every corner of the room. "Commander Alexis Chambers was my operations lead. Her conduct was exemplary, her findings were suppressed, and her recall is active, effective, immediately." No one interrupted her. No one could. She opened the folder and slid a document towards Sethi with 2 fingers. Authenticated verification packet. Asian. Transmission pathway annotations included. I request immediate amendment of participant designation and speaking priority for Commander Chambers under active recall status. Sethi took the packet, scanned the header, and then looked up at me with a different expression than the one he had worn all morning. Not warmer, simply accurate. "Commander Chambers, remain at council table. We are reordering proceedings." I stood from the back row, picked up my folder, and walked forward through the space they had reserved for observers, past the brass rail polished by waiting hands, into the seat that should have been mine at 9:02, while Roland watched in full institutional silence and said nothing at all. I set my folder on the council table, aligned it with the edge, and waited while Captain Sethi read the first page of Admiral Ward's packet in stillness, so complete I could hear the soft scrape of his thumbnail against cardstock. The fluorescent lights flattened every colour in the room except the service ribbons on Ward's chest and the raw white of Roland's knuckles, where his hand gripped a capped pen. Sethi finished the first page, turned to the second, then spoke to the clerk without lifting his eyes. "Amend the participant registry. Effective now, Commander Alexis R. Chambers. Active recall status pending assignment detail. Update placard and docket." The clerk blinked once, as if the language had arrived out of sequence, then nodded and moved quickly to the side table. She lifted my old name card, the one printed without rank, slid it aside, and typed a replacement label. The small portable printer chattered in the silence, loud as rotor chatter in my memory, and she placed the new placard before me, CDR Chambers A. That was the first public reversal. Not applause, not outrage, just institutional text corrected in real time where everyone could see it. Sethi turned toward Ward. "Admiral, confirm basis." Ward did not perform authority, she delivered it. "Suppressed findings attached at tabs 3 through 7, signed and archived under corrected incident review protocol. Command conduct evaluation at tab 8. Transmission pathway annotation at tab 9 identifies diversion nodes and unauthorized narrative substitutions in secondary summaries. Recall notice authorization at tab 10. Effective timestamp 6:40 this morning. Major Trent leaned forward. Admiral, with respect, this panel has not yet authenticated. Ward cut in with a single sentence. You are looking at authentication, Major. The room held. Sethi accepted a second sheet from Ward and scanned it, then addressed me directly. Commander Chambers, did you submit media inventory serial ending 4 C-91 at 0012 under receipt 6R-1183? Yes, Captain. Did civilian liaison Iona Mercer transfer custody to you under archive seal prior to submission? She did. Ledger entry and countersignature attached in my folder. Provide. I handed him the custody memo, receipt and interference addendum in one stack. He checked each stamp, each timestamp, each signature line. Procedure has its own tempo, and that morning it moved in my favour because I had given it what it required before anyone could call me emotional and close the file. At 9:31, Sethi keyed his microphone and spoke for the record. Panel recognises Commander Chambers as submitting party with active recall standing. Her procedural requests for preservation and media assignment are granted. Prior characterization of this matter as private grievance is withdrawn pending review of authenticated documents. He paused, then added, Statement by retired Brigadier Chambers alleging grievance motive will be entered as contested, not adopted. The language was dry. The effect was seismic. Harrow's posture changed first. He had spent the morning reclining just far enough to signal dismissal. Now he sat upright, both forearms on the table, eyes fixed on the packet in front of Sethi, as if trying to calculate how many prior conversations would need rephrasing by lunch. Trent closed her legal pad and reopened it to a clean page. The man beside her stopped typing altogether. Sethi looked to the bailiff at the door. Bring in Terminal 2 and Media Custodian. We are opening inventory now. The terminal arrived on a rolling stand, matte grey and scarred from years of secure handling. A media technician in latex gloves broke the evidence seal on my USB sleeve while reading the serial aloud. I repeated it. He plugged the drive into the isolated port and projected the file index to the side monitor. No one breathed normally for the first 10 seconds. Then the first directory opened, corrected _findings_signed. The second, command_log_clearance_extracts. The third, transmission_metadata_suppression_events. Sethi nodded once. Relevance established. He selected the recall folder, a PDF opened with defense letterhead and the blunt clarity of federal notice language. Commander Alexis R. Chambers, Active Reserve Recall, Report Directive enclosed. Service copy, Legal Residence on File, East Briar Road. Beneath it, in digital notation, served 712 at front entry, receiving party declined signature, service completed by posted notice and recorded witness. Sethi read the service line into the record slowly, each word precise. Served 712 at front entry, receiving party declined signature, service completed. Ward spoke without looking at Roland. That address corresponds to Brigadier Chambers' residence. Sethi answered, confirmed. That was the second reversal, cleaner than anything anger could have produced. The notice Roland had likely hidden at his own door, now read aloud in a legal room that no longer belonged to him. I felt no surge of triumph, only a hard internal click, like a latch engaging after years of pressure from the wrong side. My breathing steadied. My hands stayed flat on the table. Across from me, Roland reached for his water glass and discovered his fingers were shaking enough to tap the rim twice before he could lift it. His counsel leaned close and whispered, Do not freelance. Let me speak. Roland ignored him. Captain, this is administrative theatre, he said into his microphone, voice carrying less than before. A recall marker does not erase documented fragility. Ward turned her head just enough to meet him. Choose your next sentence carefully, Brigadier. He opened his folio, found the prepared page, and pushed forward. I have protected this institution from volatility for 6 years. Sethi raised a hand. Stop. We are now in evidentiary posture. You will not assert medical or fitness claims without documentary basis. I was her father before you were her clerk. Roland snapped. Sethi's tone did not change. In this room, you are a retired officer, an interested party, under review. Address the panel accordingly. The words seemed to strike him physically. Colour drained from his face in a visible wave from collar to temple. He stared at Sethi, then at Ward, then at me, as if searching for the single lever that had always worked and finding every surface bolted down. At 9:42, the side door opened and a woman in charcoal suit entered with a foundation badge clipped to her lapel. Marlene Pike, External Ethics Counsel. I recognised her from annual reports, always pictured beside compliance language most board members never read. She handed a sealed note to Sethi, then requested the spare microphone with a formal nod. Captain, with panel permission, I have a governance update materially related to participant credibility. Proceed, Sethi said. Pike unfolded one page and read in a level voice. As of 9:38, Centennial Veterans Foundation Executive Committee voted emergency suspension of retired Brigadier Roland Chambers from all leadership and representational functions pending investigation into potential falsified fitness representations, coercive interference with records access, and misclassification of government-adjacent documents in donor custody channels. No one moved. Pike continued. Brigadier Chambers is directed to cease contact with Foundation staff regarding active records and to surrender all access credentials by 1700 today. Written notice delivered electronically and by courier, effective immediately. She placed the paper on the table in front of Roland and stepped back. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. No words came out on the first attempt. On the second, one did. You. He stopped there as if language itself had abandoned him mid-command. The prepared remarks in his folio remained untouched, corners sharp, sentences never spoken. He looked at Pike, then at his own counsel, who had already lowered his eyes and begun writing a withdrawal request on a yellow legal pad. The room's silence was no longer passive. It was evaluative, institutional, and final. Roland tried again. This is retaliatory coordination. Ward answered before Sethi could. No, Brigadier, it is sequence. You simply lost control of it. His hand tightened around the pen until the cap cracked with a small plastic snap that echoed in the microphones. He set both pieces down carefully, as if careful movement could restore the composure leaking from every gesture. A sheen of perspiration had formed along his hairline despite the cold room. He reached for his throat once, fingers pressing lightly at the knot of his tie, then let his hand fall when he realised everyone was watching. Harrow cleared his throat and spoke to Sethi, choosing each word as though stepping across ice. For panel integrity, I request my earlier remark be amended. I characterised this as private dispute. That characterisation was premature. Noted, Sethi said. Trent followed, voice clipped. I request leave to submit supplemental statement after reviewing tabs 3 through 10. Granted. Each correction from them landed like an aftershock, less dramatic than Ward's declaration, but equally destructive to Roland's old architecture. His power had always depended on repetition by others. Now the repetition was reversing direction in the same room. Sethi reviewed the docket and issued orders in crisp succession. Preservation hold goes active now on routing slips, donor lockbox access logs and residential service directives tied to East Briar address. Media copy will be mirrored to oversight server. Commander Chambers will receive reporting instructions through official recall channel by 1400. Brigadier Chambers, you are not to contact Records Liaison Mercer or any Foundation staff handling this matter. Violation will be referred. Roland leaned toward the microphone, desperate for one clean objection. You cannot bar me from my own house records. Sethi met his stare. These are not house records. Roland looked at me then, fully, without podium or audience choreography to shield him. For years he had weaponized my restraint by narrating it as weakness. Now restraint sat across from him with rank restored and documents authenticated, and he had no language left that the room would carry for him. His lips parted as if to deliver one last line. Nothing came. He swallowed hard once, and the movement was visible from where I sat. Ward gathered her folder, but before she stepped back she said one final sentence for the record. Commander Chambers' silence preserved more lives than your speeches ever did. Sethi struck the gavel once, not to end the hearing, but to lock the moment into transcript. Proceedings continue under amended status. Roland lowered himself into his chair as though the joints had stiffened all at once. The colour had not returned to his face. He stared at the untouched folio, then at the broken pen cap near his right hand, and did not reach for either. Around him, people resumed movement in careful increments, clerks typing, technicians logging serials, counsel passing notes, but a clear perimeter of social distance had opened around his table, and no one crossed it. I sat upright with my new placard in front of me, the custody memo warm in my folder from being handled too many times in one night, and listened as the record moved forward in the plain procedural voice he could no longer bend. Captain Sethi called each item into sequence, forcing the morning to become what Roland had spent years preventing, a timeline no one could decorate. The legal envelope was entered as Exhibit A, with seal integrity intact. The black USB, now mirrored to oversight, became Exhibit B with 3 authenticated directories and service metadata confirmed. Sethi asked the technician to read the hash verification aloud, then asked me to confirm the number against the receipt from Windows C. I did. He asked Roland if he contested custody continuity. Roland looked at his counsel, then at the broken pen cap near his hand, and said nothing. Sethi recorded the silence as non-contest. At 10:11, the side door opened and Iona Mercer stepped in under escort, carrying a grey archive box and a thin binder clipped with yellow flags. She looked exactly as she had in the service corridor, precise, unadorned, unshaken. Sethi swore her in. She gave her statement without flourish. The diverted routing slips, the 2 objections marked resolved without comment, the lockbox misclassification, the retrieval ledger, my signature, her countersignature, archive seal. Then she opened the grey box and removed the original commemorative roll from the dinner, the one I had watched disappear behind the curtain, and set it on the evidence table beneath white light. My line was there in the earlier printout, and gone in the revised one beside it, spacing tightened exactly as I had described. Editorial deletion event occurred between 1842 and 1857, she said. Both versions preserved. Sethi marked both copies as exhibits and asked if any Foundation executive had authority to alter honorary names without board vote. Mercer answered, no. Rear Admiral Ward remained silent through Mercer's testimony, hands folded over her folder, eyes on the panel. Her silence carried more force than most speeches in that room. At 10:34, Sethi called for witness addenda from anyone present at the Portico Exchange. The lieutenant at the door collected slips. A minute later, he brought Sethi 3 written statements and 1 request to speak briefly. Sethi scanned the names, then nodded toward the rear. Colonel Marcus Doyle, 2 minutes. Doyle was the officer who had paused with his coat half buttoned while Roland demanded my pin. He stepped to the lectern with the reluctance of a man who disliked public correction, but disliked false record more. I witnessed retired Brigadier Chambers direct Commander Chambers to surrender insignia and access badge under public pressure, he said. I heard the phrases, given your history and seated by courtesy, not by right. I did not intervene. That was a failure on my part. He kept his eyes on Sethi, not me. I am correcting that failure now. Sethi thanked him and entered the statement. The Memorial Committee woman did not speak. She submitted a signed declaration confirming she challenged policy and was silenced by rank look. The junior coordinator from check-in did not appear in person either, but her typed statement arrived through HR at 10:29, confirming she had been instructed to reassign my seating, strike my title, and remove my name card from dignitary sequence. Sethi read the instruction line into record and attached the sender metadata. The colonel, who had looked down at his water glass in the ballroom, never filed anything. By adjournment, no statement came from him, and no one in that chain asked again. At 11:02, Sethi recessed for 12 minutes to finalise interim orders. In the corridor, I stood near a vending machine that hummed louder than necessary and checked my phone. The deferred counsel line called at 11:05 sharp. Intake follow-up, the same man said. Your 6R-1183 packet has been accepted for formal counsel representation. You're now assigned Advocate Lena Ortiz, Federal Service Law. She requests no direct contact with adverse party outside recorded settings. Understood. Also, your 2147 incident log from last night was matched to two independent witness submissions this morning. Your timestamp held. It did, I said, and heard the exhale I had not allowed myself in the room. When we reconvened at 11:16, Sethi delivered the orders in clipped sequence. Preservation hold was expanded to include Foundation media archives, seating directives, donor lockbox keys, and all communications that reference my fitness status over 6 years. Inspector referral was opened for coercive interference and misrepresentation. Foundation counsel Marlene Pike confirmed Roland's credentials were suspended and that surrender compliance would be monitored by a neutral custodian, not internal staff. Then she placed a sealed property bag on the clerk's desk and asked that its contents be logged immediately. One Navy enamel Foundation pin and one archival access badge, both recovered from Roland's possession after the hearing began. Sethi had the clerk display each item, photograph both, and ask me for identification. I confirmed the scratches on the badge clip and the tiny chip on the pin border from an old transport case. He entered them as recovered property, not gifts, and ordered transfer to me through the evidence window before close of business. Roland tried once more to object. "This is disproportionate." Sethi did not look up from the order sheet. "Disproportionate was 6 years of altered record." By 12:03, the panel moved from intake to implementation. The technician printed my reporting directive from the recall file and passed it down the table. Report location: Joint Aviation Readiness Command Annex, 0700 tomorrow. Medical check-in and assignment brief to follow. I signed receipt with a hand that no longer shook. Ward stepped beside me, waited until the clerk had taken the document away, and spoke quietly enough that only I heard her. "You were right to bring paper before anger." "I learned late," I said. "You learned in time." She touched 2 fingers to the folder in front of me, then straightened and addressed Sethi. No further input from me. That was her way, decisive at the hinge, absent from the applause. The hearing adjourned at 12:21 without spectacle. No one clapped, no one offered comfort language. People gathered binders, unplugged laptops, and left with the sober pace of professionals who understood that transcripts outlast impressions. Roland remained seated until most of the room had emptied. When he stood, he did not look toward me. He took his untouched folio, tucked the cracked pen cap into its spine, and walked out beside his counsel in a corridor lined with fluorescent light and federal signage, smaller than I had ever seen him. At 16:40, I returned to the Readiness Center evidence window for property release. The same clerk from midnight slid the tray toward me with procedural neutrality. Inside lay the Foundation pin, the archival badge, and copies of the release forms. "Sign here and here," she said. "Items recovered under investigative transfer. You may retain pending case disposition." I signed. I held the pin in my palm for 1 second, then placed it back in the tray. "Please note abandonment," I said. "I do not reclaim organizational insignia." She looked up. "Abandonment is irreversible." "Noted." She marked the line and sealed the pin in a new evidence pouch for storage. I clipped the archival badge to my folder instead. It was inactive, still scuffed, still mine to account for. Outside, the cold had sharpened toward evening. By the second week of October, dusk arrived early enough to make office windows look like lit compartments on a ship. At 18:12, a uniformed courier met me in the center lobby and handed over the final callback I had been waiting for. Certified proof of service for the recall notice first posted at Eastbriar that morning and duplicate delivery to me as active recipient. The form included the serving officer's bodycam reference, timestamp, and note. Receiving party declined signature, notice affixed and photographed. Nothing left to argue about addresses, intent, or whether the paper had existed. I walked out with the duplicate in my bag, crossed the plaza where flags snapped in cold wind, and sat for a minute on a granite bench facing the memorial wall. The metal letters caught the last light, each name cut deep enough to hold shadow. I thought of the One Fork place setting at table 19. The stopped clock in the service corridor frozen at 19:12. The camera lowered when I stepped out of Roland's frame, the valet who kept his eyes forward, the colonel who finally spoke, the one who never did. None of those details were trivial now. Each had found its place. Evidence, witness, omission, or permanent silence. At 19:03, my phone chimed with one final official message from Recall Command. Reporting confirmed. Transportation slot reserved 5:30. Bring identification, directive copy, and prior command log credentials. I typed one word back, confirmed, and locked the screen. I stood, adjusted the strap across my shoulder, and began walking toward the transit line under a sky the colour of hammered steel. I did not feel restored by Roland's collapse. I felt restored by sequence completed, record corrected, and duty returned without negotiation. Silence had not been peace, and it had never been proof that I was weak. It had been the price I paid until truth had a witness, and now truth had a transcript, a docket number, and my name attached in full. My name is Alexis Chambers, and I walked back into service under my own rank, owing the man who tried to erase me nothing at all.